It's over there. It has to be, he said, pointing to the sea. Well, I forgot my swimsuit, and I really don't enjoy being eaten by reptiles, so it's all on you guys, Jay said, backing away from the water. It can't be in the water, Mal said, yanking out the map from her pocket. She gasped. Guys, come here. They all gathered around Mal. Look, there's more. More ink had appeared, and this time they saw that the fortress wasn't technically on the Isle of the Lost at all, but was located on its own island, or rather its own piece of floating rock, which was just so happened to be named the Isle of the Doomed. Well, that's cheery, Carlos said. And just how are we supposed to get over there? Evie asked. Mal studied the map and pointed to a spot labeled Goblin Wharf. We'll hitch a ride from one of our friendly neighborhood goblins to row us over, of course, Mal said, pushing past them and staring up the muddy beach toward the decade. Wait, I lost my place. I don't think that's right. We'll hitch a ride from one of our friendly neighborhood goblins to row us over, of course, Mal said, pushing past them and starting up the muddy beach toward their docks, where the goblins unloaded the Auroran barges. There's no such thing as a friendly goblin, Carlos sighed, but like the rest of them, he followed behind Mal. They arrived quickly at the busy port, mostly because the alligators had taken to snapping at them from the shallow water by the beach, and they'd sprinted screaming toward the dock. The wharf was bustling with activity. Goblins pushed their way past the foursome, attempting varying... Goblins pushed their way past the foursome, emptying cargo from the big Auroran ships that were allowed in and out of the magic dome. They placed the rotting and rotten goods onto the splintering wood wooden boardwalk and jumped on and off each other's makeshift rafts and boats. They hooted and hollered in their goblin tongue, tossing bags of scraps and leftovers, clothing, food, cosmetics, electronics. Yeah, from the page. Everything the people on Auroran didn't want anymore or had no use for, onto teetering rickshaws to sell at the market. We'll need to pay for passage, Mal said. They're not going to take us over there for free. The four of them emptied their pockets to pull enough of a sum of trinkets and food to pay their way. The four of them emptied their pockets to pull enough of a sum of trinkets and food to pay their way across to the Isle of the Doomed. It took some haggling. Jay did most of the talking, as he spoke a bit of Goblin from having worked at the shop, but they finally secured a spot on a scrap boat. That is, a boat that collected anything and everything that fell off the Auroran dumpsters. It was a scavenger of scavengers, the lowest of the bottom feeders. As it turned out, a goblin's boat was not constructed to hold 4 teenage villains. The floating wooden box creaked and groaned as Mal and the others boarded. If I die, Jay said darkly, you still can't have any of my stuff. We'll be fine. We'll be fine, Evie said, but she seemed to say it more for her own benefit than anyone else's. The goblin snickered and started the ancient rusty motor, and off they went into the thick fog. It was odd to see the Isle of the Lost from the water. It almost looked pretty, Mal thought. The forest was lush and green around the edges of the island, and the rocky beach jutted out dramatically into a rolling blanket of navy blue water. In the distance, she could see Bargain Castle from Bargain Castle. From far away, it seemed to be gleaming in the fading sunlight. Funny how different things look from far away, huh? Evie said, following Mal's gaze back toward Isle of the Lost. Yeah, sure, whatever, Mal said, turning her back on Evie. That same ache was settling in her gut again, and she didn't like it. She didn't like it one bit. Mal could only be sure they'd arrived at the Isle of the Doomed because the engine had stopped. They still couldn't see 5 feet in front of them. Mal scrambled blindly out of the boat and onto the rocky beach, followed quickly by the rest of the team. The goblin quickly sped off. Tim's... losing my spot. And then I make up words in my head. Let's see. Followed quickly by the rest of the team. The goblin quickly sped off. The fog lifted slightly as they made their way through the brush. Soon they were standing in front of a gate covered with a painful-looking bristly forest of thorns. And beyond the gate, high on a craggy mountaintop, stood a large black castle, a ruined, forbidding wreck silhouetted against the night sky. The thorns around the gate grew thick and twisted, so sharp they would stab or scrape anyone who dared come near. Worse, the thorns were covered with deadly poisonous spiders, and the whole place had a toxic and sinister air. They stood paralyzed, unable... and unwilling to figure out what to do next, while the black box in Carlos's hands kept beeping incessantly. If it was indeed communicating with the dragon's eye, it was clear that the scepter was somewhere behind the thorny gates. Mal crunched up her face, frustrated. It was Jay who broke the silence. He handed Mal and Evie each a silver dagger, and Carlos some bug spray. He himself hauled a red-handled machete. Oh, because of the spiders. So he handed Mal and Evie each a silver dagger and Carlos some bug spray. He himself hauled a red-handled machete. You carry an axe in your pocket? Asked Carlos. Who doesn't? Jay said with a smile. When you steal enough things from all over the place, I find that you always arrive prepared. Mal had to admit that Jay's loot came in handy right then. Jay hacked a path with his machete, and the others followed close behind. Mal slashed at a branch of thorns. With her silver dagger, and the branch withered and shrank from her knife. Evie did the same. On the other side, and Carlos sprayed a hairy tarantula with his spray so that it fell off a branch dead. It would be hard work, but they were used to it by now. Deeper they went into the dark forest, making their way to the castle above. And that is the end of chapter 20. We're actually pretty close to the end of this book. I wonder if they're going to wrap this up or leave us hanging. I'm not sure. I don't know much about this storyline. I never saw the show or anything. So that's it for chapter 20. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you for chapter 21, which I should get done within a day or two, I hope, because this is... Oh, actually, I just took this out again, so this one doesn't need to go back. But I do have a bunch of other ones that do need to go back, so I'll probably be focusing on those. But I try to keep track of who's viewing what. So when I see that somebody's already viewed chapter 20, then I try to get 21 posted. So I'll keep an eye out. I'll try to get things posted. If by chance I don't, feel free to leave me a message and say, hey, I'm waiting. Okay? So thanks for tuning in. Subscribe. Tell your friends. These are great videos for people who don't like to read. They still get exposed to fabulous stories and books, and it's just relaxing to sit and listen to a story, or when you're going to bed or whatever, to put a book on, somebody reading to you was such a nice thing. Even I, as an adult, had somebody that used to read to me, and it would put me right to sleep at night. I love the stories that I had from that experience, so I hope you're getting the same experience. Ciao for now. Mwah. Hey kiddos, welcome back to Nana's Book Corner and to the Isle of the Lost. Hopefully you're not lost today and you're just looking to visit the Isle of the Lost for a moment. I know I'm being goofy today, I'm sorry. That was really silly to say. But anyways, we're on chapter 21, Tale as Old as Time, from Beauty and the Beast. Tale as old as time. Okay, I won't sing and scare you. Okay, chapter 21, Tale as Old as Time. Just be yourself. There are other ways to show strength than your father's kind. Ben's mother's words rang in Ben's ears as he sat down to meet with Grumpy, who had been elected to represent the dwarfs and sidekicks in their petitions. Great. Wonderful. Just perfect. A one-on-one with Grumpy. Ben shook his head. He suspected anyone else would have been a better person to negotiate with than the crabby old dwarf. Last time they'd met, the infamous dwarf had been insulted by a sugar cookie. These talks were doomed. Ben wished that people would stop telling him to be himself. It sounded like such simple advice, and maybe it would have been if he had had any idea who himself was. But who was he? Prince Ben, son of King Beast, heir to the throne of the great kingdom of Oregon? He was certainly nothing like his father, who knew how to enforce his rule without forcing it on his subjects. Ben cringed to recall how he had stood on the table and yelled. That wasn't who he was. He was Prince Ben, son of King Beast and Queen Belle, heir to the throne of the great kingdom of Oregon. And if, like his father, he was meant to inherit the throne, then it would be on his own terms, as his mother's son, and not just as his father's heir. Because, like his mother, Ben was quiet and gentle and loved nothing better than to disappear into a great thick book. Kind of like me. His childhood hadn't been about hunting or sword fighting or besting someone else on the field. It had been spent in a library. He shared his mother's love of reading, and he always had. Ben's fondest memories were of sitting next to Queen Belle at the hearth of her magnificent library's enormous fireplace, reading by her side. He'd be digging into a pile of books dragged from the lower shelves, while hers were always taken from the very highest. It was paradise. Once, when his father had discovered they had spent the entire day hiding in the library and scolded them for skipping out on a royal luncheon banquet for the sake of a story, his mother had mounted a passionate defense. But these aren't just stories, she'd said. They're whole kingdoms. They are worlds. They're perspectives and opinions you can't offer, from lives you haven't lived. They're more valuable than any gold coin and more important than any state luncheon. I should hope you, as king, would know that. King Beast's eyes had twinkled, and he had lifted Queen Belle into his powerful arms with one easy motion. And as you're my queen, I should hope you would know how much I love you for that. Then he'd gathered up his young son, and the three of them had made a late lunch of cream cakes in the garden. Of course, Ben smiled. He hadn't thought about that day in a long time. He found himself thinking of it still as Lumiere ushered the older dwarf into the conference room. Grumpy nodded to him and took a seat across from the prince, his short legs swinging like a child's. "What's this all about, young man?" he coughed. "I'm not in the mood for any of your tantrums." He eyed the table uneasily, as if the boy was about to leap upon it even now. The plate of sugar cookies and the goblet of cider in front of him he left untouched. "Thank you for meeting me today," said Ben. "I thought this might be easier if it was just the two of us talking, since everything got a bit loud before." "Hem," said Grumpy. "We'll see about that. You don't plan to hop on the table again or shout like an animal, do you?" Ben flushed. I apologize for my behavior the other day. I was a fool. You... What? Grumpy was caught off guard. Ben shrugged. I admit it. I didn't know what I was doing, and I made a mess of everything. And I certainly don't blame you for not wanting to take me seriously now. Grumpy looked at him grumpily, if a little pleasantly surprised. Go on. Ben smiled. It was a start, and he'd take it. You see, I called you in because I read all 1,001 pages of your complaint. Really? All 1,000? Asked Grumpy, sounding impressed in spite of himself. And one, Ben smiled again. He was a fast reader and a concerned listener, and if he was truly going to be himself, he was going to need to use both talents in his favor to settle this complaint once and for all. From what I could gather, it appears what you and your colleagues are demanding is to be heard and to have a voice in your future. Something more than just a seat at the council. It's not that much to ask, is it? Asked Grumpy keenly. No, it's not, Ben acknowledged, and I think we can come to a simple agreement. What do you propose? Ben shuffled the papers. He thought about it, and about how to say it. How had his mother put it? Perspectives and opinions I can't offer, from lives I haven't lived. Ben smiled. I propose listening to the people who know best. Grumpy raised an eyebrow. Ben consulted his notes. Let's start with the mermaids. They should charge a silver coin for every undersea tour. And I'll talk to Ariel about giving Flounders Collecting for Ariel a break. Grumpy nodded. Sounds reasonable. Okay. I've also set up a college fund for the Dalmatians. All 101 of them will be eligible for financial aid through the puppy grant. Ben pushed a black and white spotted folder that contained all the pertinent forms across the table. Grumpy accepted it. Pongo will appreciate that, said Grumpy. But what about us miners? Half of everything you mine must still remain the property of the kingdom, said Ben. He knew his father would settle for no less. Half? What about the rest of the diamonds? Where does that go? Asked Grumpy, sounding alarmed. The other half will go to a 401d fund, a retirement fund for dwarfs, to take care of your families and your children. Tell Bashful not to worry. Sounds fair enough, Grumpy nodded in spite of himself. What about the restriction of magic? Just between you and me, those 3 fairies make a lot of noise. The 3 good fairies will have to take their complaint up with the fairy godmother. I can't do anything about it myself, I'm afraid. But I'll get them a meeting with her, that much I can do. And Jeannie's request for unlimited travel within the kingdom? Grumpy frowned. At this point, he looked like he was struggling to find things to still be grumpy about. Approved, so long as he clears his itinerary with the palace beforehand. That was a difficult concession to make, as his father did not want the blue-skinned maniac popping up everywhere without notice. But he had been able to convince King Beast that as long as the subjects were warned about Jeannie's arrival, all would be well. Grumpy folded his arms. What about the woodland creatures? They're working their paws and hooves to the bone. I've had a team install dishwashers, washer-dryers, and vacuum cleaners in every household. It's time we realize we're living in the 21st century, don't you think? Forest woodlands included. Meh, said Grumpy. I don't care much for modernity. But I think our furry friends will appreciate it. It's hard to do dishes by hand without, hands. Ben tried not to laugh. As for Mary and the mice, from now on they will be well compensated with the finest cheese in the kingdom, from the king's own larders. Ben let the last paper drop. Fair enough, Grumpy nodded. So we have a deal? Grumpy put out his hand. Deal. Ben shook it. He was more relieved than he let on. At least he hoped he wasn't letting it on. At this point, he was sweating so much he couldn't be entirely certain. You know what, young man? Huffed Grumpy with a frown. Ben steeled himself for a grouchy comment, but none came. You're going to make a good king, the dwarf said with a smile. Give your father my best, and send your mother my love. "I will," said Ben, pleased by how well the meeting had turned out. He pushed his own chair back from the ancient table. His work was done, at least for today. But if this is what being king is all about, then maybe it isn't as hard as I thought. The dwarf picked up his stocking cap and hopped down from his seat, turning toward the council room door. Then he paused. "You know, son, sometimes you remind me of her." Queen Belle was much beloved in the kingdom. Ben smiled. "You know, I really hope I do," Grumpy shrugged, pushing open the door. "Not nearly so pretty, though, I'll tell you that much. And your mother, she would have made sure we had a cream cake or two, and at least a few currants in the cookies." Ben laughed as the door slammed shut. And that, my friends, is the end of chapter 21. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'll see you for chapter 22. I'm just going to keep one chapter per video, unless they're only a couple pages, which this one was a little bit longer. So that way, I don't have to do half videos if the chapter is longer. It looks like 22 is a lot longer than that one, so that I would have to stop in the middle of that one if I kept on. So we'll just keep it one chapter per video from now on, okay? So I'll see you for the next chapter, and ciao for now. Mwah!
By teaching young people in the way that their stories are reflective of the people around them, we're teaching them that they can create change in their communities. I'm committed to cheer on and mentor our younger generations as they find their own voice by voting, because we all deserve to be seen and heard in California.
Kiddos, welcome back to Nana's book. Heidi ho, welcome back to Nana's Book Corner. And to The Isle of the Lost, a Descendants novel by Melissa de la Cruz. And we are on chapter 22, which is entitled Gargoyle Bridge. How exciting, Gargoyle Bridge. This is a longer chapter than the last one, so it's quite long. Let's see how we do with this one. Every moment of this adventure had already proven to be a little more adventurous than Carlos had anticipated. This revelation might have been a problem for the average man of science who didn't like to run the tombs and who kept to the labs as much as possible. Sure, Carlos had felt a little seasick on the journey over to the Isle of the Doomed, but he'd been able to hold it down, hadn't he? If he looked at it like that, he'd already proven himself to be a better adventurer than anyone could have reasonably expected. That's what Carlos told himself anyway. Then he told himself that he'd done better than anyone else in weird science would have. He actually laughed out loud at the thought of his classroom nemesis in this current situation, which had prompted Jay to shove him and ask if he didn't think he was taking the whole mad scientist thing a little too literally. "I'm not crazy," Carlos reassured his fellow adventurers. Still, willing himself not to yak into the churning sea itself had required more than his share of exhausting determination, and by the time the four of them were back on land and all the way clear of the thorn forest, no worse for wear, save for a few scratches and itchy elbows, Carlos was more than glad to find a real path leading up to the dark castle on the hill above them. Plain old dirt and rock had never looked so good. until it began to rain and the dirt became mud and the rock became slippery. At least it wasn't the sea, Carlos consoled himself, and the odds of a person actually drowning in mud and rocks were incredibly slim. Besides, his invention was now beeping at regular intervals, its sensor light flashing more brightly and more quickly with every step that drew them closer to the fortress. The dragon's eye is definitely up there, Carlos said excitedly, feeling a scientist's enthusiasm as at a working experiment. If this thing is right, I'm picking up on some kind of massive surge in electrical activity. Electrical energy. If there is a hole in the dome, it's leaking magic here somehow, different from the Isle of the Lost. Maybe the hole is right above this place, said Evie. Yeah, I can feel it too, Mal nodded, still moving forward along the path. Do you guys? She stopped and looked at them, shielding her eyes from the rain with one hand. Carlos looked at her in surprise. Feel what, this? He held up his box and it beeped in her face. Mal jumped back, startled, and Jay laughed. Whoops, Carlos said. See what I mean? The energy is surging. Mal looked embarrassed. I don't know for sure. Maybe I'm imagining it, but it almost feels like there's some kind of a magnet pulling me up the path. That is so creepy, Evie said, stopping to wipe sweat off her forehead with the edge of her cape. Like it's your destiny, literally calling. Well, said Carlos. No, not really. If it were literally calling, it would be, calling her. Jay laughed. Evie glared at him. Okay, fine. Literally pulling like a magnet. Only not really, because it's, destiny. Are you happy now? Literally? Carlos raised an eyebrow. Jay laughed again, which made Carlos feel good, though he couldn't exactly explain why, not even to himself. Don't you guys feel it? Mal sounded nervous. Nobody said anything, and she sighed, turning back to the muddy path. They'd only made it up past the next curving switchback in the path when Mal stumbled and fell, sending a slide of rock down the trail behind her. Ooh-wah! Mal yelped, her arms flailing. The dark stones were so slick with rain that she couldn't right herself, only slipping on the rocks again. Evie caught Mal before she tumbled headfirst down the stony path. Both girls flew backward into Jay, who almost toppled Carlos behind him. I got you, said Evie, helping Mal to regain her balance. Yeah, and I got you, Jay said, which is great for everyone but me, Carlos said, barely keeping one arm around his device as the other held Jay off him. The human doorstop. I am definitely in the wrong shoes for this, Evie said, wincing at the sight of her own feet. We need flippers, not shoes. The rain has turned this whole trail into a mud river. Maybe we should all hold hands, Jay suggested. We'll work better if we're all together. Did you really just say that? Mal shook her head, sounding disgusted. Why don't we just sing songs to cheer each other up and then weave flowers out of the mud and move to Oregon while we're at it? Come on, Mal. Carlos tried not to smile. He knew that Mal, of all of them, had the hardest time with anything more beneficent than maleficent. Do you have a better idea? Jay looked embarrassed. If you wanted to hold my hand, you could just have asked, teased Evie as she offered it to Jay, waggling her fingers. Well now, Jay winked. You don't say. Evie laughed. Don't worry, Jay, you're cute, but thieves aren't my style. I wasn't worried, said Jay smoothly, grasping her hand in his firm grip. I just don't feel like taking a mud bath today. From a physics perspective, it does make sense if you want to talk about Newton's second and third laws, Carlos added, trying to sound reassuring. Momentum and force and all that. What he said, Jay nodded, holding out a hand to Mal. Carlos watched him, wondering if Jay and Evie were flirting, and if that was why Mal seemed mad. No, Mal and Jay bickered like siblings, and Jay and Evie were just trying to cover up the fact that they were scared. Jay had told him earlier that he thought that Evie was cute all right, but he thought of her like he did Mal, which meant he didn't think of her at all. Carlos thought that if the girls had been their sisters, Mal would have been their annoying, grumpy sister, while Evie would have been the manipulative, pretty one. And if Jay had been his brother, he'd be the kind who was either laughing at you or punching you when he wasn't busy stealing your stuff. The longer he thought about it, the more Carlos decided it wasn't so bad to be an only child after all. Come on, Mal, just take it. Even Newton agrees, Jay said, wiggling his fingers at Mal, while still grasping Evie's hand tightly in its other hand. Mal gave up with a sigh, grabbing it only after a slight hesitation. Mal then held her hand out to Carlos, who grabbed it as if it were a lifesaver, seeing as he knew his physics better than any of them. Somewhat awkwardly and little by little, the four of them pulled and pushed and helped each other slosh their way up the muddy path, sweaty palms and muddy ankles and cold feet and all. Before long, the pathway curved once again, and now the thick rain cloud surrounding it seemed to part on either side of the four adventurers, revealing a sudden and dramatic vista. What appeared to be a long and slender stone bridge, half shrouded in mist, that jutted out above a chasm in the rock directly in front of them. "It's beautiful," said Evie, shivering, "in a really terrifying way." "It's just a bridge," Carlos said, holding up his box, "but we definitely have to cross it. Look." The light was flashing so brightly and so quickly now that he covered the sensor with one hand. "Duh," Jay said. "It's not just a bridge," Mal said in a low voice, staring at the gray shape in front of her. "It's her bridge. Maleficent's bridge. And it's pulling me. I have to cross it. It wants me to get to the other side." "It's not the bridge I'm worried about," Carlos said, looking into the distance. "Look." Beyond the bridge in mist, a black castle rose from a pillar of stone. The bridge was the only way to reach the castle, as sheer cliffs surrounded the black fortress on all other sides. But the castle itself was so forbidding it didn't exactly look like a place that wanted to be reached. "That's it," Mal breathed. "That has to be the Forbidden Fortress, the darkest place on their dark isle, Maleficent's old lair and ancestral home." "Sweet," Jay said. "That's one sick shack." Evie studied it from behind him, still shivering. "And I thought our castle was drafty." "I can't believe that we actually found it." Carlos stared from his box to the castle. "And I can't believe it was so close to the island all along." Mal's eyes were dark, and her expression was impossible to read. She almost looked stunned, Carlos thought. "I guess that explains the rain. The Forbidden Fortress hides itself in a shroud of fog and mist. It's like a moat, I guess." Carlos examined the air around him. "Of course it is. A defensive mechanism built into the atmosphere itself. I'm sure my mother designed it to keep everyone she didn't want out." She didn't say the rest, and Jay said it for her, which meant, everyone. Carlos found it hard to look away from the black tower on the hill. No wonder the citizens of the Isle of the Lost were told to keep away. Here was concrete proof of villainy, of the power of darkness and infamy. Maleficent's darkness. It wasn't just any evil. What loomed in front of them was the most powerful and most storied darkness in the kingdom. Carlos suddenly felt it, the magnetic pull Mal had tried to describe. He could feel it thrumming in the air, in the very stones beneath his feet. Even if magic was no longer a factor, there was power here, and history. "Feel that?" Carlos held his vibrating hand up into the air. "I can too," Evie said, picking up a rock from the mud. It rattled in her fingers as she held it. "Destiny," she announced dramatically. Jay pointed at the lightning that crackled in air above the black turrets. "Me too. I guess it's time." Mal didn't say a word. She only stared. "Hold on now. We're not in any rush," Carlos said. "We need to do this just right, or—" He didn't finish the sentence. He just shrugged. Then he caught Mal's gaze and knew she felt the same way. "Look," Jay said, yanking back an armful of overgrown vines that covered the stony steps leading up to the main ramp of the bridge. He tossed them to the side. "What are those horrible, ugly creatures?" Evie made a face. "No thanks. I'll stay on this side of those things." Because now the vines were gone, they could see that the entire bridge appeared to be guarded by ancient stony gargoyles. The winged griffins glared down at them from where they perched, flanking the bridge on either side. "Lovely," Jay said. Carlos stared. It wasn't only Mal who could see her mother's hand in every stone around them. The carved creatures sneered in exactly the same way Maleficent did, their teeth pointed, their mouths cruel. Mal looked at them frozen. Then Carlos realized it was because she was paralyzed by fear. "Mal?" She didn't answer. She can't do this alone, Carlos thought. None of us can. It's no different from pulling each other through the mud. It's just physics, if you think about it. It's science. But then Carlos tried not to think about it because his heart was pounding so loudly he thought that the others would hear it. He began to recite the periodic table of the elements in his head to calm himself down. Atomic numbers and electrons were always somewhat comforting in times of stress, he'd found. And the more numbers he recited, the easier it was to put one foot in front of the other, which is exactly what he did. Carlos stepped up onto the first stone paver that led to the sloping bridge. Just as he did, the stone gargoyles began to flap their wings in front of him. "Whoa," Jay said. "No," Evie said. "Just no." How is this possible? Asked Jay. There's no magic on the island. The hole in the dome, said Carlos. It must have sparked the castle to life or something, like a chemical reaction. It made sense. Not only had Diablo been unfrozen, but the whole fortress as well. Carlos moved his way up the next step, and then the next, until he was standing level with the main ramp of the bridge itself. Mal and Evie and Jay now followed behind him. The creatures growled as they came to life around them, the bridge rumbling beneath their feet. The griffins' horrible eyes glowed green, illuminating the fog around them, and they were practically shining a spotlight on the four intruders. The gargoyles uncurled their hunched backs, now almost doubling themselves in height. Evie was right, Carlos thought. They were really ugly things with snaggly teeth and forked tongues. He couldn't look away from the hideous faces hovering over him. This must be residue, left over from the magical years, he said. Whatever did this was probably part of the same power that sparked Diablo to life. The same power? Mal looked spellbound. You mean my mother's? Or the same electromagnetic wave? Carlos thought about his last weird science class. I'm not sure how to tell the difference anymore. Jay swallowed as the gargoyle leaned down, looking as if it could spring at Carlos at any moment. Right now, I'm pretty sure the difference doesn't matter. Who goes there? Boomed the gargoyle to the right of Carlos. You cannot pass, said the one on his left. Yeah? Says who? Carlos took a step back, as did the rest of the group, following behind him. They looked at each other nervously, unsure of what to do next. They hadn't known about the gargoyles, hadn't expected a fight. This was going to be more difficult than they expected, maybe even impossible. But it didn't matter. Even Carlos knew there was no turning back now. You ugly things need to move, said Mal, shouting from behind him. She glared at the griffins. Or I'm going to make you. The gargoyles growled and grimaced, flapping their stone wings as a threat. Any ideas? Carlos looked over his shoulder nervously. We don't have weapons or magic. What will we fight with? Besides, how do we fight something made of stone? There has to be a way, Mal said. We have to pass. She shouted again. Let us through. Yeah, I'm not sure that's working, Evie sighed. The gargoyles glared at the children with glowing eyes, their fangs bared, their stony wings beating the wind. You cannot pass, they said again in unison, and just as the creatures spoke, the thick gray clouds surrounding the long stone ramp dissipated, revealing a gap in the bridge, a 40-foot gulf with nothing below but air. The bridge was broken, virtually impassable. Great, Jay said, so it's over. Fine, whatever.
Play now.
Can we go now? The others just stared. Carlos had to admit Jay was probably right. There was no apparent way to reach the castle. They had come all this way only to fail. Even if they could pass the gargoyles, there was no way to cross the bridge, since there was no bridge. It was hopeless. The journey was ended before it had truly begun. Carlos stepped back and noticed something carved in the stones at the foot of the bridge. He sat down to read it. What is it? Mal asked, kneeling next to him. He brushed away the dirt and moss to reveal a sentence carved in the stones. Ye who trespass this bridge must earn the right of way. Great. So what are those, like directions? Mal looked at the others. What does that mean? How do we earn the right of way? Evie shook her head as she glanced back up at the gargoyles and the broken bridge. I don't know, Mal. We don't seem to have earned anything. And technically, we are trespassers, Jay said. Evie frowned. I think we should go. Maybe the bridge was destroyed. Maybe it's been like this for years. Maybe no one gets in and out now. No, those words have to mean something. But is it a riddle or a warning? Mal asked. She looked at the gap in the bridge and pushed her way past the others toward the edge. She was determined to figure it out. What are you doing? Carlos yelled. Mal, wait! You're not thinking straight. But she couldn't wait, and she didn't stop. He took a step back, Jay and Evie flanking him. Go after her, Carlos said. pull her from the break in the stone before she falls. This is crazy. Jane nodded and followed her. Sorry, needed a wet whistle. It's so sad, Evie said, to have come this far. I know, but half a bridge might as well be no bridge at all, Carlos muttered. He put down his machine and turned it off so that he wouldn't have to listen to it beeping. The noise of the sensor, more proof of how close they'd come to finding the source of power, only made things much worse. The moment Carlos killed the machine, the light in the gargoyle's eyes faded. The airy glow receded back into their black stone sockets. Wait, did you just... Carlos looked incredulous. Turn off the monsters? I think so. He called out to Mal, who was now standing with Jay, just a few feet from the break in the stone ramp. They're like big doorbells, Mal. When we try to cross, they turn on. When we go to leave, they turn off. So they're another defense mechanism? Evie looked unconvinced. Maybe, Carlos studied the bridge. Anything's possible, at least that's what I'm starting to think. Mal came running back. So maybe it's just a test. Look, she said, approaching the gargoyles, their eyes once more glowing. Ask me your questions, she called up to the guardians of the bridge. Let us earn the right of way. But the gargoyles didn't answer her. Maybe you're not turning it on right, Evie said. Maybe this is just a waste of time, Jay sighed. No, it's not, Mal said, giving them a beseeching look. This is my mother's castle. We found it, and there has to be a way in. Look at the inscription on the stone. It has to be some kind of a test. Jay spoke up. Carlos said, well, they're like a doorbell, but what if they're not? What if they're like the alarm system in a house? All we would have to know to disable them is the code. He shrugged. I mean, that's what I would do if I was trying to break in. Of any of us, he would know, Carlos thought. So what's the code? Mal turned back to the gargoyles, her eyes blazing. Tell me, you idiots! She drew herself up to her full height and spoke in a voice that Carlos knew well. It was how Cruella spoke to him and how Maleficent spoke to her minions from the balcony. He was impressed. He'd never seen Mal so like her mother is now. Mal did not ask the gargoyles. She commanded them. This is my mother's castle, and you are her servants. You will do as I bid. Ask your riddle and let us pass, she ordered, looking as if she were home, truly home for the first time. Because, as they could all see now, she was. A moment went by. The mist swirled in the background, ravens cawed, and green light pulsed in the distant windows of the castle. Carlos, hissed the gargoyles in disturbingly creepy unison. Approach us. Hearing his name, Carlos took a step forward with an awestruck look on his face. Why me? Maybe because you touched the step first, so the alarm is set on Carlos mode? Jay scratched his head. Better you than me, man. Time for the passcode, Mal nodded. You got this, Carlos. Then the gargoyles began to hiss again. Carlos! First question. Carlos took a breath. It was just like school, he thought. He liked school. He liked answering questions that had answers, right? So wasn't this just another question that needed just another answer? Ink spot in the snow, or red, rough, and soft. Black and wet, warm and fast, loved and lost. What am I? No sooner had the gargoyle stopped speaking than rumbling began beneath their feet. Carlos, Evie cried, stumbling as she tried to stand in place. What? Carlos ran his hand through his hair anxiously. His mind was reeling. Ink is black, snow is white. What's red and rough? A steak? Who loves a steak? We haven't had those in a while anyway. And what does any of this have to do with me? Answer the question, Mal said. The light was once more fading from the gargoyle's eyes. It's, Carlos said, stalling. He was stuck. Black, white, spots, red, loved, lost. The puppies, my mother's puppies, the Dalmatians. All 101 of them, all loved and lost by her. He looked up at the stone faces, though I think the love part is debatable. Silence. Do I need to say the names? Because I swear I can tell them to you. Every last one of them. He took a breath. Pongo, Perdita, Patch, Lucky, Roly-Poly, Freckles, Pepper. When he had finished speaking, the mist once more congealed around the bridge. Carlos let out a sigh. It hadn't worked. Wait, Mal said, pointing to the spot where the mists had congealed. It's doing something. The gray mist parted, revealing a new section of the bridge, a piece that had not existed a moment ago. The gargoyles cleared a path, and the four of them ran onto it, hurrying to the newly formed edge, waiting for the next question. Next riddle, Mal demanded, just as a ferocious wind blew at them. Carlos was beginning to get the feeling the bridge had more than a few ways of getting rid of unwanted visitors. He swallowed. They needed to hurry. Or rather, he did. Carlos, next question. He nodded. Like a rose in a blizzard, it blooms like a cut, a red smear. Her kiss is death. The gargoyles hissed in their eerie unison, turning to face them, claws raised. Their muscles flexed and their tails whipped, their forked tongues raking their fangs. It looked as if they might pounce at any moment. Once again, the bridge began to shift beneath their feet. Her kiss is death, echoed Carlos. It has to be about my mother. Is that the answer, Cruella de Vil? The bridge began to shake even harder. Wrong answer. But it is about your mother, said Evie suddenly. A rose in a blizzard, it blooms like a cut. Her kiss, it's about what color lipstick she wears. Cruella's signature red. Carlos was dumbfounded. It is? A red smear, see? It means it's something she puts on. Oh, I know what it is, Evie said. The answer is cherries in the snow. That has to be it. It's been everywhere this season. I mean, judging from what's been thrown away on the dumpster barges. Mal rolled her eyes. I can't believe you know that. The wind whipped up again, and the four of them locked hands, holding on to one another for support. They pressed their shoulders together, bracing themselves against the gale. Evie cursed. It's not cherries in the snow? I could swear that was it. Red with a pinkish undertone? No, wait. It didn't have a pink undertone. It was darker, redder. A true red. What did the magazines call it? Frost and Flame? No. Fire and Ice, that's it. Cruella's pout is made of fire and ice. The gargoyles paused, their eyes glowing. They stood in place as the mist once more congealed around the bridge, then thinned to reveal another new section. Carlos relaxed. Jay whooped, and even Mal clapped Evie on the back as they advanced across the bridge. One more answered question, and the way would be clear. Ask your last riddle, Mal charged them. The gargoyles looked crafty. Carlos, last question. He nodded. Mal looked at him encouragingly. Here it goes, one last time. Dark is her heart, black like the sky above. Tell us, young travelers, what is her one true love? The creatures hissed in unison, and as soon as they finished speaking, they walked toward the four, teeth shining, claws raised, wings flapping. The gargoyles would tear them to shreds if Carlos answered incorrectly. The four of them saw that now. Carlos had to get it right, not just to cross the bridge, but to keep them alive. Dark is her heart. They must mean Maleficent, right? He turned to Mal. But it could mean any of our mothers. My mother has no true love. My mother loves nothing and nobody. Not even me, said Mal with a slight pang that Carlos knew all too well. Don't look at me. I don't even have a mother, Jay said. Beauty, Eve called out. That's mine. I know it's a little cliche. But the gargoyles were not interested in anything anyone had to say. Coming closer, parting the mists, their tails swishing. What is her one true love? They demanded, looking from Evie to Carlos to Mal to Jay. My father? Mal ventured. Carlos shook his head. If Maleficent was anything like Cruella, she hated Mal's father with a vengeance. Cruella had forbidden any questions about his own, no matter how curious Carlos was, how much he wanted to know. As far as Cruella was concerned, Carlos was hers alone. Maleficent had to be the same. The gargoyles were nearly upon them. They were taller than Carlos had realized, maybe 8 or 9 feet. They were enormous, and their weight made the bridge groan beneath their every step. Carlos didn't think even the periodic tables could help him now. "What is her one true love?" the gargoyles asked again, extending their massive wings. When they flapped, the mist swirled about them. "The dragon's eye?" Mal guessed. "That's all my mom cares about." "Being the fairest one of all?" Evie shouted. "Her or me? In that order?" Jay just shrugged. "I can't help. I'm pretty sure the answer isn't Jafar, Prince of Pajamas." At first it looked as if the gargoyles were shaking their heads, but Carlos realized it was because the bridge was rumbling so much. Everything was quaking, and the gargoyles were nearly upon them. His teeth began to clatter. Evie lost her balance and slipped, almost falling over the side, but Carlos caught her in time. Jay held on to a crumbling post and held out his hand so that Carlos could hold onto him, forming a link to Evie. "Hurry! Somebody better come up with something," Jake grunted. "I can't hold on much longer." Evie screamed as she dangled off the bridge, Carlos clinging to one of her blue gloves, which she was slipping out of, one finger at a time. "Think, Mel, what does Maleficent love?" Carlos yelled. "She has to love something. What is her one true love? Answer the riddle or fall into darkness," the gargoyles intoned. "Diablo?" Mal screamed. "Is it Diablo?" In answer, the bridge buckled under her feet. and Mal slid down, only by luck managing to hold on to Jay, who was anchoring everyone. The entire castle was shaking. Stones flew down from its ramparts, and the towers threatened to crumble on top of each other. The bridge began to sway dangerously. "Wait!" screamed Jay. "You guys, they're not talking about Maleficent. They're still talking about Cruella. Quick, Carlos, what is her one true love?" Carlos couldn't think. He was too scared. He couldn't even put a sentence together, and he was even more frightened by what the answer would be. Maybe that was why he hadn't guessed right this time. "I can't bear to say it out loud." Jay's voice echoed. "Carlos, what is your mother's one true love?" He had to say it. He'd almost always known. Sometimes, like this afternoon, he would think she meant him, but he really knew better, because she never meant him. Not once. Not ever. Carlos opened his eyes. He had to say it, and he had to say it now. "Her furs! Fur is her one true love," he yelled. She said it all the time. She had said it that afternoon in front of everyone. "All my mother cares about is her stupid fur coat, closet, and everything in it. But you guys already know that." It was the truth. And like any truth, it was powerful. In the blink of an eye, the four of them were standing on the other side of this gargoyle bridge, and everything was set to right once more. There was no more swaying or rumbling. No one was falling over the side, and the gargoyles had all turned back to stone. Although Carlos would swear that one of the stone gargoyles had winked at him. They were safe, for now. "Nice work," said Mal, breathing heavily. "Okay, now. Where to?" Carlos shakily looked at the beeping box in his hands. "This way." And that is the end of the chapter. That was 30 minutes. That was a long one, but it had a lot of excitement, so I barely even noticed how long it took. So that's the end of chapter 22. I'll see you guys for chapter 23. We're getting to the end of the book. You can see we don't have that much left here. But I think there might be, I don't know if there's another one. There might be another book after this one. It's just going to depend on whether or not my library has it. If not, I'll have to order it. But anywho, I hope you're enjoying it. That got really exciting, that chapter. I was a little scared there for a second for them. Okay, ciao for now. See you for the next one. Mwah. Oh, and by the way, if you're listening to this one, and this is the only one you're listening to, you might want to check out The Dangerous Days of Daniel X. It's quite a nice book, and it's very exciting. And it's about Daniel, who's an ordinary boy. He's a teenager, and he's actually also an alien hunter, and he can, dream up his parents and pretend they're still alive even though they're not. People can see them and everything. It's really kind of cool. He uses his imagination to make things real, and it's a really cool book. So I'm reading that on some other videos, so you might want to check those out too, because it's a really fun story. And also I'm doing the Harry Potters, and I'm going to be doing some classics like Charlotte's Web. I'll be starting soon, probably once I finish this one. And I'll be doing Michael Vey. That's a whole series. So some really good books are coming, and some are already going on out there. So check the video list. There's some really fun ones out there. So ciao for now. And I also have some others, older ones out there that are really fun. Because of Winn-Dixie is a great story. It's a classic. So check that one out as well. Okay? Ciao for now. Hey kiddos, welcome back to Nana's Book Corner and to the Isle of the Lost. Hopefully you're not lost today and you're just looking to visit the Isle of the Lost for a moment. I know I'm being goofy today, I'm sorry. That was really silly to say. But anyways, we're on chapter 21, Tale as Old as Time, from Beauty and the Beast. Tale as old as time. Okay, I won't sing and scare you. Okay, chapter 20. Heidi ho, welcome back. Hey kiddos, welcome back to Nana's Book Corner and to Isle of the Lost. Because I left you hanging with such suspense, I'm going to continue on with this one before I read chapters from another one. But this is, chapter 23 is called The Wonder of It All. Here we go. This one is not as long as the last one, I hope. I don't think it will take me as long to read it. So the last one was 30 minutes. This one is definitely not as long. The Forbidden Fortress lived up to its name. Once the four adventurers had found their way in through its massive oaken doors, it was almost impossible to tell the darkness of the shadow world outside the castle from the shadow world within. Either way, it was intimidatingly dark, and the farther Jay and Carlos and Evie and Mal crept inside, the more their nervous whispers echoed through the ghostly, abandoned chambers. Jay wished he'd worn something warmer than his leather vest. Mal's lips were turning blue. Carlos's breath appeared in white clouds as he spoke, and Evie's fingers felt like icicles when Jay grabbed them. Once, or twice, and strictly for warmth. It was colder than Dragon Hall inside, and there was no chance of anything getting any warmer. There were no logs on the fireplace grates, no thermostats to switch on. That's modern castle living, Evie sighed. Trade in one big cold prison for another. Mal nodded in agreement. Privately, Jay thought that Jafar's junk shop seemed downright cozy in comparison, but he kept that to himself. Inside every corridor, dense fog floated just above the black marble floor. That has to be magic. The fog doesn't just do that, Mal said. Carlos nodded. The refracted energy seems stronger here. I think we're closer to the source than we've ever been. As he spoke, an icy wind blew past them, whistling in through the shattered stained glass windows high above them. Each step they took reverberated against the walls. Even Jay, the master thief, was too intimidated to try and take anything and kept his hands to himself for once. Of course, once they did find the scepter, he'd have to man up. Jay knew that, and he'd made his peace with it, no matter how well they'd all gotten along on the way there. Villains don't have friends, and neither do their children. Not when you get right down to it. None of them had come there out of loyalty to Mal or friendship. Jay knew what he had to do, and he'd do it. Until then, his hands stayed in his pockets. If this haunted place was selling it, he didn't want it. "What's that?" Jay asked, pointing. Green lights flashed through the half-shattered panes of glass, but he couldn't figure out the source. "It's what we've been tracking all along," Carlos answered. That same electromagnetic energy. It's going crazy. He shook his head at the flashing lights on his box. This fortress was definitely exposed to something that's left, a kind of residue charge. "You mean an enchantment?" He shrugged. "That too. And so even after all these years, this place is somehow still glowing with its own light?" Evie looked amazed. "Cool," Jay said. Mal shrugged it off. "In other words, we're getting closer to the Dragon's Eye." "Yep," said Jay. Like the rest of the group, he knew what everyone else in the Isle and the kingdom knew. That the evil green light meant only one terrifying person, even if it probably reminded Mal of home. Corridors led to more corridors until they passed through dark hallways full of framed paintings shrouded in cobwebs and dust. "It's a portrait gallery," Evie said, straining to see the walls through the shadows. "Every castle has one." "Mal, stop it," Jay shouted, looking behind him and jumping away. Mal reached out and tapped his shoulder. She was standing right in front of him. "Hello? I'm not back there. I'm over here." "Crap. I thought that picture was you," he pointed. "That's not me. That's my mother," Mal said with a sigh. "Whoa, you really do look like her, you know," Jay said. "You two could be twins," Evie agreed. "That, my friends, is called genetics," Carlos said with a smile. "Gee, thanks. I look like my mother?" "Just what every girl wants to hear," Mal replied. Still, Jay knew different. What Mal wanted more than anything was to be What Mal wanted more than anything was to be just like her mother. Exactly like her. Every bit as bad and every bit as powerful. That was what it would take for someone like Maleficent to even notice her, and Jay could tell that this portrait gallery was only making Mal want it that much more desperately. Now what? Mal asked, as if she were trying to change the subject. Jay looked around. Before them were 4 corridors leading to 4 different parts of the fortress. A foul draft issued from each of the paths, and Jay could have sworn he heard a distant moan, but he knew it was only the wind. Winding its way through the curving passages, he yanked a matchbook from his pocket and lit a match, muttering a quick, "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo." "How scientific," Carlos said, rolling his eyes. "You got your way, I got mine." "That one," Jay said, pointing to the corridor directly in front of them. Just as he did, the wind blew out from that same passage, and the foul stench of something rotted or dead came along with it. The wind snuffed his burning match out. Evie held her nose, and Mal did the same. "Are you sure about that?" Mal asked. "Duh, of course not. That's why I played." "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. One corridor is as good as the next," Jay said, entering the corridor and not waiting for the rest to follow. It was the first rule of breaking into an unknown castle. You never let it get to you. You always act like you know what you're doing. Jay had the feeling his fortress was playing with them, offering them choices when really all roads probably led to the same place. It was time to take matters back into his own hands. "No, wait, you don't know where you're going. Carlos, check your box compass thing," said Mal. Carlos brought the box up to the intersection. It beeped. "Okay, I guess maybe Jay's right." "Of course I am." They followed Jay into the dark corridor. Carlos held the beeping box in his hands, the sound echoing off the stony walls. It led them to a dank, cold stairway that led further downward, deeper into darkness. The air felt colder and damper, and in the eerie silence came a distant rattle, like bones striking rock, or chains rattling in the wind. "Because that's comforting," Evie sighed. "The dungeon," said Mal, "or you might know it as the place where my mother